Hi all, and welcome to this first bite size on checking for understanding. Within this bite size, we'll do kind of a general overview of all of the different areas of checking for understanding that we're going to be looking at. And then we'll go into a bit more detail on specifying success and then how we can plan for feedback for our students. So within checking for understanding overall, we will be looking at the following four areas. So as I said then, today we'll be looking at specifying success and planning for feedback. Next week, we'll be looking at how we can gather responses during instruction. Then we'll move on to gathering responses during circulation. And then finally, we'll look at how we can use accountable questioning. Now, a lot of these things we'll cover also within the learning forums that are coming up on the 21st of January. So some of these things will be included within our formative approaches, our modelling forums, and within our disciplinary literacy forum. But we're going to try and look at these in these bite size as separate entities and then start to think about how they might link into some of the other things that we've been looking at throughout the year. So when we think about specifying success and planning for feedback, our first port of call is to really understand what success is actually going to look like. So as part of our planning, as we go into our lessons, we have to be really clear as to what the success criteria for learning is going to be. So what is it that the students are going to have to know, have to do, have to understand in terms of therefore them being successful within their learning. The steps that I'm going to go through now then are kind of things that we can look at in kind of two areas, both before we actually get into our lessons, but then as we're in the moment in our lessons, what are the things that we can be doing that allow us to kind of specify success and plan for feedback, but also ensure that we're using that to fully understand what our students either do know or don't know, or either can do or can't do at any given moment. So first of all, then we need to be thinking about planning feedback for the most important content. So we need to think about how students might go about their learning, but also then anticipate any errors for the most important questions that we're going to be asking in our lessons. What we can do from here, then, we can consider how will we feedback on those errors. Now, the kind of process that we could go through this is making sure that from our success criteria that we've clarified in our planning, we can then identify that crucial knowledge first. So what must the students absolutely know by the end of the lesson? What must they absolutely know and remember in 2 weeks' time? What must they know and absolutely remember in 4 weeks, 5 weeks' time? When we've got a clear idea as to what that content is actually going to be, we can then design our questions effectively and also design the likely feedback that we're going to need to give to our students. By kind of anticipating these errors, we're making sure that we are prepared, that when those misconceptions arise within our lessons, we have tailor-made feedback ready to give to the students. When we've got our questions in, so when we understand the things that we're going to ask and we've got that clarity over the most important content, we can pre-plan some exemplar answers. So it might be that we script some exemplar responses to these different key questions in our lessons. So this will allow us to know what success is going to look like and also help us to support the students to reach that standard as well. It allows us to kind of set the standards for success for the students. So when they are checking work for themselves and checking their own levels of understanding, they can be in a position where their self-assessment can be really accurate compared to the exemplar responses. Obviously, then when there are gaps between what the students are producing and our own exemplars, we can then be in a position to assist them in terms of closing those gaps. What we can also then do to help them is to annotate those exemplars with the success criteria. So from our success criteria that we've prepared before the lesson, actually labeling those exemplar answers with that success criteria allows us to be really precise about what makes it a great answer. What we're therefore then doing is exemplifying our own thinking process behind the output so that students can then also engage in similar thought processes to produce their own excellent standard of work. Moving on here then, so we've got this idea of planning for likely errors. So similar to this kind of planning feedback for the most important content, we've probably already identified what the most likely student errors are going to be within the concepts that we are teaching. It's important that we consider the aspects that they will struggle with, because that will allow us to give feedback quickly and accurately. So where that misconception, where that lack of understanding actually happens, we're able to give feedback quickly and accurately so that students can therefore then progress with their work. From here then, we need to make sure that we are identifying those specific moments where we are going to check for understanding. So what is the point at which we're going to stop teaching and therefore then the students are going to work independently? When that happens, it's important for us to plan that kind of moment to check for understanding either at that point or around that point. So it might be either just before we release them to go and work on their own, we check for that understanding, or it might be that we've allowed them to kind of work independently within the apply phase for a minute or so, and then we go round and we start to check what's going on in the classroom. Whilst we're checking then, whilst we're going around, it might be that we're creating diagnostic questions. We're kind of using these after we've exposed the students to new content to really then check that understanding. Now, it might be that within these diagnostic questions that we're kind of including the correct answer along with maybe other plausible options. And by including some plausible options, it might be that if students are going for those plausible ones, but they aren't the right ones, that's kind of then highlighting and revealing those common student misconceptions around the room. Now, a few things that we need to think about as we're doing this. Each time we go around, it might be that we have a class size that we can get to every single student. It might be that we are sampling different groups of students when we're going around to check for different elements of understanding. But after we've kind of done that, it's then our decision, well, how do we go about this? Are there misconceptions that a large number of students are having, so we need to address it as whole class feedback? Or actually, is this something that only one or two students are dealing with, or it's only a misconception of only one or two students, so therefore I can have much more individualized conversations? So essentially, as we go through this as an overall methodology, we're thinking about building these as steps both before and during teaching. So part of our planning is to create our success criteria and to think about the most important content, to plan some of those questions that students might have about the work, to create exemplar, to attach our exemplar to success criteria so that students know not only what a good one looks like, but also how to create it as well. It's important that we take time in lessons to understand what's happening in front of us. So when we are releasing the work to the students, when we've handed over and they are being independent, it's important that we take time to stand back, have a look at what's going around the room before we then plan our interventions. A minute or two as students are working independently should be enough time to kind of glean who is able to get on with this, who is struggling to start, who do I need to assist first of all. We can then start to think about, well, actually, as I'm going around, what are those misconceptions that might be coming out, and how might I then choose to feed back to everyone in the room? And that really is therefore then the last step. It's that balance between individualized and whole class feedback, and we base that on what we find out about them. If it's just the one or two people that are struggling with something, we can give that individualized feedback. But actually, if we've got generic misconceptions going on around the room, it might be that we're looking at whole class feedback or a different raft of questions or some reteaching to actually then cover the misconceptions so that students can progress as much as possible. Anyway, I hope this has been useful. As ever, if you have any questions about any of the content, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks so much.